was 9 years old, I came home from school one day to find my mom and my grandpa sitting at the kitchen table. They'd been waiting to give me some bad news, and that bad news was that my dad was missing. He and my Uncle Lee had gone off on a weekend hunting trip and were about half a mile into the woods east of Coretta when Dad realized that he'd left his grunter in his truck. And a grunter is basically just sort of a duck whistle, but it sounds like a buck's grunt, and after telling Uncle Lee to wait where he was, Dad walked back to his truck, never to be seen again. Uncle Lee said that he waited about 20 to 30 minutes before he started to get worried, and then he made his way back to the truck. But my dad was nowhere to be found, and by nightfall, Uncle Lee had every deputy from the McDowell County Sheriff's up in those hills trying to find my dad. And the search effort lasted about 2 weeks, but after failing to find a single trace of him, the county sheriff called it off. Mom kept his name on the missing persons register for a long time, while the whole family and all of his friends pitched in to hire a private investigator. The guy was a retired police officer from Charleston, a good one too, but in the end, there was only one thing that he could tell my mom and grandpa that they hadn't already heard from the county sheriff. The most likely explanation was that, for some reason, Dad had walked through the woods until he came to a series of old mining pits near a town called Cucumber. And then, as their theory goes, Dad walked into one of those mines, fell down a shaft, and his body had been laying in the bottom ever since. Yet during that initial search and rescue attempt, every mine shaft that could be safely explored had been mapped out by a team of caving specialists. And the tunnels that weren't safe had teams of cadaver dog handlers dispatched to them. Dad's body wasn't found in any of them, though. That didn't mean that it wasn't there. The sheriff couldn't rule that out entirely, but there was something that he neglected to mention that Mom later found from the PI that she hired. There was graffiti in one of the mine shafts. The private investigator said he didn't recognize any of the symbols or words, but they'd been crudely daubed in a sort of spray paint about midway through one of the tunnels, so he could only assume that the place was a hangout for local teens. And that's what led him to believe that the kids who'd tagged those tunnels might also know what happened to my dad. And despite his best efforts, he couldn't locate any of them. Uncle Lee tried to help as best he could and kept in close contact with the private investigator, but he took Dad's disappearance harder than anyone. Everyone kept telling him that it wasn't his fault, that there was no way that he could have known and that he did all the right things. But he was never quite the same after Dad disappeared, and no one could blame him. I didn't get the full story of what had happened until I was much older, but between the day he went missing and the day Mom had him declared legally deceased, there was a lot of hope and a lot of heartbreak. Having my sister and I asking when is Daddy coming home almost drove Mom crazy with grief. But as we got older and we accepted that he was never coming back, it got more and more easy to deal with until it just kind of faded into the background. Dad's disappearance was behind us, but it was still there. It was always there, really. By the time I was 22, my sister had moved over to Morgantown for college, and I was working full-time at a fixin' shop in Welsh, and I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in maybe 4 or 5 years by that point. He sent us birthday and holiday messages and would occasionally call Mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance, but other than that, he kept himself very distant. At least until the day when Mom said that he'd called and had asked to talk to me. I was more than happy to see him for the first time in years, and I understood why Uncle Lee had kept his distance. He once told my mom that I reminded him of a younger version of my dad, and while some of those memories brought him a lot of joy, they brought him a lot of pain too. And because of that, I thought I wouldn't see much of Uncle Lee anymore, and that brought me quite a bit of pain as well. And so you can imagine how happy I was when I'd heard that he wanted to meet up. I drove over to his place out near Filbert one Saturday around midday, and what followed was what I can only describe as a 2-person family reunion. We were both happy to see each other, and after spending all morning worrying that he'd be some depressive alcoholic, it was a huge relief to see him very clear-eyed and on his feet. As we caught up, we shared some cold cuts and chow, along with a cold beer, and the conversation sort of meandered around the subject of my dad until there was no avoiding him anymore. We talked about this and that, things he used to do and how much we missed him. And then out of nowhere, Uncle Lee had a proposal for me. He asked if I wanted to visit the site of my dad's disappearance, suggesting that it might provide a degree of closure. He said that he'd been up in those hills east of Coretta about half a dozen times, and even though he'd never found so much as a trace of my dad, it helped alleviate the feeling of uselessness that had plagued him ever since. And at first it didn't sound like such a hot idea. I could appreciate why walking those hills helped Uncle Lee deal with the pain and loss, but to me, meandering around the area my dad vanished from sounded like slow torture. I was just happy to be in touch with my uncle again, someone I could actually build a relationship with, because after my grandpa died, he was the only paternal figure I had left. Focusing on my dad like that, in a negative way I mean, I couldn't see the benefit. Yet slowly but surely, over the course of about a year or so, I came around to the idea that this might provide some much-needed closure. I've been visiting Uncle Lee every couple of weeks between the time we first got in touch and the day that I suggested that we drive up into the hills east of Coretta, and then hike out to the place that he last saw my dad. He was happy to hear that I'd changed my mind, but it was very muted, for lack of a better word. Kind of like he didn't want to show the emotion of how much it meant to him, because he was worried that it'd scare me off. He didn't ask what had changed my mind, but if he did, I'd have told him that it came down to something as simple as this. If I started feeling too emotional, negatively emotional I mean, we could always just turn around, walk back to my truck, and drive home. Nothing was keeping me there, and if walking those woods didn't provide any good feeling, at least I'd be able to say that I tried. Uncle Lee and I arranged to drive down to Coretta together on a Saturday morning in early May. To my relief, we'd somewhat shifted the focus away from my dad's disappearance and began treating it like a regular old hike through the woods. We'd uphold our long-standing tradition and take along a few beers and some cold cuts, and then if at any point I felt like talking about him or asking questions about my father, then we could cross that bridge once we came to it. I'll admit to feeling a little anxious as we drove alongside the creek and got closer to the back road we were good to park my truck on. But by the time we got to walking and talking, I realized that patch of woods was no different than any other in West Virginia. I'd always considered that area around Coretta to be haunted. Not literally, of course, but it might as well have been like the ghost of my dad was wandering those hills. I never wanted to go there as long as I lived, so to suddenly be there one day and realizing it was mostly all in my head, it was definitely good for me. But the word mostly is kind of carrying a lot of the weight in that sentence. And as much as it felt regular as anything to be walking through those woods with my Uncle Lee, it was like there was still a piece of my dad out there, hiding away someplace. Call it a memory, call it hope. But there was something, and I could feel it. And we kept on walking and talking till we got to Big Creek, and then after making ourselves comfortable on a flat rock at the edge of the creek, we had ourselves a little break. And I figured that marked the halfway point of our hike, so when we were done, I suggested that we head back towards my truck. But Uncle Lee had another idea. He said that there was something he wanted to show me. And then after another mile or so of walking, we came to a rocky outcropping which overlooked the abandoned mines that I told you about earlier. I asked him if that was the place the private investigator had checked out all those years before, and Uncle Lee said it was. And then after a sigh, he said that there was something he'd never told me and my mom. He told the sheriff all right, and he told the PI too. He just never had the heart to tell me or Mom that the last time he'd seen my dad had been when he was walking in to one of those mine shafts. So between noticing my dad was missing and informing the authorities, Uncle Lee said that he'd run all over the woods calling out Dad's name and trying to find him before the situation got serious. Uncle Lee said that he was never much of a tracker. He simply got lucky in heading in the right direction. He didn't think my dad had walked in the direction of those mines, but when he stood in that exact same spot that we were stood in, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like my dad walking into one of the dark, derelict tunnels. Uncle Lee said that he scrambled down the steep incline of the outcrop and then ran off in the direction of the mine shaft that he'd seen my dad walk into. But when he got there and walked inside with his flashlight in hand, there was no one there. When I asked Uncle Lee if he'd seen the same weird graffiti as the PI did, he said no, but that there was something about that old mine shaft that made him feel very uneasy. According to Uncle Lee, that's what had truly been haunting him for all these years. The idea that he'd seen his brother walk into a dark tunnel, then upon hearing his name being called had chosen to hide in the dark, pretending not to hear. And to him, that was the best case scenario. The worst case was that something had happened to him in that old mine, something terrible that meant that he couldn't walk or talk anymore, even if he wanted to. I understood why such information had been withheld from me. The situation was bad enough, without piling more unsettling mystery on top of it. But still, I told Uncle Lee that I was glad that he'd shared the whole truth with me, even if it was as disturbing as it was painful. And I figured after that it was time to leave, but Uncle Lee had another proposal for me, and one that I found impossible to turn down. He asked if I wanted to walk down to the mine with him, as it was something he himself did every so often as part of his attempt to exorcise that area of the hills. And by that point, I couldn't think of a reason why we shouldn't. We'd already walked all that way, and I had no idea if or when I'd return. And so not heading down to that mine seemed like it'd be a wasted opportunity, and if it worked for Lee in dispelling some of the heartache, then it might just work for me too. And so I agreed, and off we went. Heading down the steep face of the outcrop was definitely not a smart move, so we walked around the edge of the mining pit a little bit to find a safer way down. At the bottom, all kinds of warning signs had been hammered into the dirt telling people to keep out, and that they'd be seriously injured if they tried exploring any of the old tunnels. I asked Uncle Lee if he thought that my dad had fallen down a mine shaft or had been the victim of a freak cave-in that had left him unable to respond to his cries. He didn't know for certain, but if that was the case, Dad's body would have been found a long time ago. Whatever happened to him, it happened in that old mine. It just hadn't been properly explained yet. As we got closer and closer to the mine's entrance, which appeared as a jagged scar in the rock, it was like the air itself grew heavier. Very little light was making its way down the tunnel, but I remember seeing splintered wooden beams jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth in the mouth of some great serpent. Neither myself nor Uncle Lee said a word as we approached the entrance, and the place was so quiet that the sound of our boots crunching into the gravel and slate seemed unnaturally loud. I started to see things like discarded tools, a cracked lantern, a coil of frayed rope half buried in the dirt. Things which suggested the mine had been abandoned in a hurry rather than in an organized or phased fashion. I asked Uncle Lee if he knew why the place had been abandoned in the first place, and he said that he'd heard rumors of flooding, but didn't know for certain if they were true or not. The official explanation was that the company had simply gone out of business. But if that was true, why did the place look like it had been abandoned so hastily? And as we got within just a few feet of the mine's entrance, it was like the temperature dropped by a few degrees, and the darkness in front of me seemed to swallow up all the outside light after just a few feet. I figured Uncle Lee could sense my apprehension, because he started telling me how I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to. All I had to do was say the word and we could just leave. But like I said, there was no way I was going to just turn around and go home, Not after we'd walked all that way. And so, slowly but surely, I started walking toward the entrance and the rusted cage bars of the open gate beyond. I can recall the oddest things from the first few moments. I remember how it got even colder as I stepped into the shaft, and how the air had both a smell and taste to it too. Just dust, metal, and mold all rolled into one. The light from outside disappeared quickly, but luckily, I had a tiny flashlight that I kept attached to my keyring, and so after sort of fumbling with it to free it from the ring, I held down the small button and suddenly I could see again. I say I could see again, but not by much. The light from the little keyring attachment was only enough to keep a few feet of darkness at bay, so my pace stayed slow as I tread deeper into the tunnel. I took a few steps and then stopped, then, after taking a few more, I turned around to check if Uncle Lee was following me. But when I did, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Uncle Lee was standing near the cage gate, almost like a total silhouette by then, but there was just enough light for me to see that he held something in his hand. It was something that I knew that he had with him, but something he had no reason to produce in that moment. It was a gun, and the hand that he held it in was shaking. In the microseconds that followed me spotting the gun in his hand, part of me screamed out to reason with him, and there was a brief glimmer of hope when the thought occurred to me that he'd produced that pistol for our own safety. But the way it trembled in his hand, the way he didn't say a single goddamn thing as I turned back to look at him, I got this feeling, sharp as a blade, that I wasn't safe at all. And so I ran. I ran down that tunnel with my tiny crappy flashlight as the first of Lee's gunshots rang out. The crack split the air behind me, and the bang felt like it exploded my eardrums as I felt the bullet fly past me, all in the same moment. And my adrenaline surged as I realized, to not make myself an easy target, I had to turn my flashlight off. Then as I eased my thumb off that button, I was just plunged into darkness. I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I didn't know it was even possible to feel that level of terror. The only light came from Uncle Lee's shots as my lungs burned and my muscles began to scream, and any second I expected to either take a bullet or slam into a complete wall. As it turned out, I was headed for a wall, and the only thing that alerted me was seeing one of Lee's bullets ricochet off something metallic. I flicked on my flashlight for a second and saw the tunnel diverting into 3 different directions, and I picked a path in a split second and then kept running. And only then I was out of Lee's sight that I could switch that little flashlight back on and start looking for a place to hide. As I ran into the diverting tunnel, the weak glow of the flashlight in my hand started to bounce off the much narrower walls, and I suddenly realized something had been written on them. At first I thought it was the graffiti the private investigator had mentioned, but even while running at full speed, I saw it was unlike any variety I'd ever seen before. It looked like writing of some kind, smeared in black paint, and an entire section of the tunnel appeared covered in what had to be more than 1,000 lines of it. I didn't even recognize the language, but for reasons you're already aware of, I also didn't have time to stop and study it. What I was really looking for was a place to hide, and I soon found one. Soon after I started to see all that weird script on the walls, I started to see a bunch of smaller and larger chambers leading off from the tunnel that I was running down. I picked one at random, lunged into it, and then tucked into the nearest corner to conceal myself from Lee's flashlight in case he pointed it into the chamber. I kept my breathing shallow, but my heart was hammering against my ribcage, and I quickly realized my hiding place did nothing to dampen my terror. Sure, I was out of Lee's sight, at least temporarily, but more than anything, I realized I was trapped. I remembered how I tried to stay as quiet as possible, but for the first few minutes, which felt like hours, my ears rang non-stop from the tunnel having amplified that sound of Lee's shots. I wondered if my hearing would ever go back to normal, And imagine Lee being able to creep right up on me without me ever being able to hear him. It was almost a relief when I started to hear his voice, along with the sound of crunching gravel as his footsteps got closer and closer. I wasn't deaf, but I was still trapped, so what little relief I felt was quickly drowned out by the raw terror of knowing that I was being hunted. Lee started calling out my name, telling me to come out, not trying to reason with me or make excuses for shooting at me, just telling me that I needed to come out because sooner or later, he was going to find me. I couldn't move. The sound of my footsteps would have almost certainly alerted him to my location, so I had no other choice but to remain in place and stay quiet as possible. That part was surprisingly easy because running all that way, with how unfit I was at the time, meant that I was more than happy to stay still and just catch my breath. When his footsteps got louder still, he suddenly pointed his flashlight down the tunnel my hiding place was at. Staying still and quiet suddenly got a lot harder in that moment. I remember saying it over and over in my head, with my voice being clear as a bell in my mind, saying, "Don't come down here. Don't come down here. Please, God, don't let him find me." And I guess God listened, because instead of heading down the tunnel that I was in, he just kept on walking. I thought that might be my chance to make a run for it. If Lee was heading deeper into the mine, then maybe I could slip out behind him. But that glimmer of hope was quickly snuffed out when I remembered how loud my own footsteps would be, and how he might not miss all of his shots that time. And he technically had not missed all of his shots. I later found a bullet hole running through one of the flap pockets of my jacket. But like I was saying, I stayed dead still in that dark chamber, keeping my ears tuned for Lee's voice and footsteps. They were still ringing from the shots, and I could hear my heart pulsating into my ears, but it wasn't as bad as it had been previously, and I could hear almost every word Lee was saying as he continued to hunt me down. His footsteps were slow and steady, and occasionally he mumbled something I couldn't quite make out. But then suddenly, his footsteps went from slow and rhythmic to sharp and quick with a scrape of gravel, and then there was silence. It sounded like he suddenly turned around, like he'd heard something that had startled him, and he figured it was me trying to make a break for it. He stayed still for a few moments, a horrible silence hanging in the air, and then he said, "I know you're here, Stanley." And hearing those words terrified me in ways I never thought possible. Because Stanley isn't my name. It was my dad's name. It was like my mind was on the verge of fracturing from the combination of terror, confusion, and painful memory. Uncle Lee must have lost his goddamned mind. There was no other explanation for it, and the reality of what that meant for me was almost too much to handle. I wanted more than anything to try and reason with him, to appeal to a sense of kinship. We'd already lost one man in the family. There was no reason to lose another, especially not by his own hand. But I also knew that there was a chance that that gamble would be the last I'd ever take. He'd already tried to kill me, and there was nothing to say that he wouldn't try again. In the end, I resigned myself to just staying put, and simply waiting until he came around the corner of my hiding place. I'd rush him, and try to get control of that gun. Then whatever happened next, I could only hope for the best. But as I listened to his footsteps become slow and steady again, waiting for them to get louder and louder before I saw his flashlight, we both heard the sound of something else moving in those tunnels. I couldn't tell you who it was. They didn't say a word, and I didn't hear any additional footsteps. All I heard was what sounded like rocks shifting someplace deeper in the tunnels, and then Lee started to speak. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. He just stopped dead still and then started to mutter something under his breath. I had absolutely zero clue what was going on. I was scared out of my mind, but all I could do was stand there, still as a goddamn statue, and keep my ears tuned like my life depended on it. Because it did. And Lee just carried on muttering to himself, or at least it sounded like he was muttering to himself. And then out of nowhere, I felt this rush of warm air blow through the tunnels, like it was coming from deep down someplace, and it smelled like evil. And when I say that it smelled like evil, I only use that word in place of death. I was about to write it smelled like death, but as someone unfortunate enough to have come across a rotting deer carcass in high summer, it's not the same scent as what I smelled in that mine shaft that day. It wasn't that sort of sick smell of rot and decay that makes you want to either puke or run or both. It was something so foul it shouldn't exist by any natural law. It smelled like burning death. That's the only way I can truly sum it up. Like something that can't exist here on the surface, something older than the mine itself. It had me covering my mouth and nose with my shirt because my first assumption was that it was one of those toxic gases I once read about miners having to worry about. And I remember thinking, so this is why they had to abandon this godforsaken place, as I kept my shirt clamped over my mouth and nose. And then suddenly, I hear Lee begin to yell something. I can't guarantee that these were his exact words, merely by recollection of them, but to my memory he said, "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." He repeated himself a lot, said stuff in between like "please" or "you gotta believe me." But he said that first part over and over, in fits and rage, with his screams getting louder and louder until I couldn't make the words out anymore. By the time his yells had degenerated into what sounded like screams of pain and terror, I made a run for it, in the hopes that he was suitably distracted. He wasn't anywhere near the tunnel I was in. I didn't even see his flashlight as I ran, but during the whole time that I was hurtling out of that tunnel at speeds I was sure would end in me falling, I heard Lee's screams. I kept on hearing them as I ran out into the daylight too. They were much fainter and had this eerie, echoey quality about them, but I could still hear them right up until they suddenly went silent. And I didn't look back though. I didn't even consider it. I just kept on running towards the gentler slope we'd used to climb down into that pit. I then scaled it and then carried on running through the woods until my legs screamed out no more. The woods were quiet, but Uncle Lee's screams kept on echoing around in my head, and I was overtaken by these contradictory feelings of trauma and this bizarre sense of victory. I'd made it out, but I couldn't enjoy that feeling because, for whatever reason, Uncle Lee hadn't. When I couldn't run anymore, I began walking back to my truck, and it took a long time before I spotted the glint of its metal bed through a thinning thicket of trees. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, and then after yanking it open, I slid into the driver's seat and just sort of sat there for a moment, staring at the windshield. I couldn't even process what had just happened to me, and I think I've already said this, I couldn't feel happy that I made it either. Instead, it was just this numb sense of resignation that I had to drive home and report my own attempted murder to the county sheriff, along with a single word: why? I could only manage to drive my truck as far as Coretta before I had to stop. There was no way that I'd be able to drive safely given my condition, and it was the first place available to call the sheriff's department. My hands were still shaking when I asked a motel receptionist if I could use their phone. I could tell that she was a little scared of me on account of my appearance and demeanor, but she let me use their phone all the same. I didn't bother trying to keep the call private. I mean, I lowered my voice, but with a girl right there in front of me, there wasn't much that I could do to keep her from hearing. I told the dispatch lady that my uncle had tried to kill me at the abandoned mining pit north of Cucumber, and how I thought that he'd had some kind of accident and was still inside. And I must have sounded real wigged out and distant, but they understood enough to send help. 2 deputies showed up to the motel in a cruiser maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, and I told them everything. They wrote it all down, then they told me that they'd call me once they checked out the mines. I drove home, took a shower, and tried to process everything that had happened, but there was no processing it. And even after all these years, I still haven't been able to. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the deputies. They found footprints and shell casings, but no Uncle Lee. And what followed was the exact same process as what happened after my dad went missing. At least, I imagine it all went down a similar way. The sheriff got search and rescue involved, who once again explored the mine as deep as it was safe to do so, and there was no sign of Uncle Lee anywhere. No blood, no body, no weapon. Only those shell casings lying near the entrance from where he'd shot at me and I'd run. I told them all about the rush of warm air and how Lee had started to scream, "He's here, I brought him, I did what you asked." And then after many weeks of investigating and consulting with experts, the county sheriff announced their conclusion, and this is what he told us. In mining, there are things called blowouts or gas blowouts. These events involve accidental releases of gases like methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon dioxide, all of which can build up in the mines and prove toxic at certain concentrations. They're caused by things like drilling, blasting, and sudden changes in pressure, and cause poison gases to rush out like tsunamis of toxic vapor. And it's one of those blowouts that the sheriff believed me and my uncle had been caught up in. They explained that in all likelihood, Uncle Lee was hit with a kind of gas cocktail, consisting for the most part of highly concentrated CO2, and this led to a kind of frightened disorientation which ended up causing him to attack me in his confusion. Naturally, given the circumstances, the sheriff told me and Mom that Lee had become the #1 suspect in my dad's disappearance, in which there had almost certainly been some kind of foul play involved. There had been no activity in his bank account after he disappeared, which was probably the #1 reason we all thought that he was gone and hadn't just decided to vanish without a trace. I mean, it was still possible that Dad going missing had nothing to do with what Lee did later, but the sheriff himself said that he was very interested in catching up with Lee so he could find out why he'd called me by my dad's name instead of my own. But more than 2 decades have passed now, and not a trace of Uncle Lee or my dad has ever been found. After the sheriff and his search and rescue people searched the mine, he ordered them all to seal it off with explosives to prevent others suffering the same tragic fate. But their opinion of what Lee's fate was and my own opinion differ greatly. I didn't make a fuss at the time, and I still don't. And what I'm writing now is the first word of objection I've ever committed to paper, let alone voiced out loud. But I don't believe for a second that it was some rush of CO2 that made Uncle Lee start shooting at me. I told the sheriff back then over and over that the rush of warm air didn't happen as we were walking in. It happened as I was hiding, right before Lee started calling out for my dad, saying all that weird stuff and eventually screaming unintelligibly. But the sheriff and his experts acted like I got it all wrong, that I was so disoriented by the fear, the adrenaline, probably a dose of CO2 myself, that I didn't really know what had happened to me. But I do know what happened to me, and I know what happened to my Uncle Lee too. I just don't think I'm ready to actually say it. I also don't think that I'll ever be ready to really say it, because doing so feels like opening the door to some great and terrible darkness. I just know that there's something out there, deep in those mine shafts just north of Cucumber, that's better off left alone. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill's Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity, with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. Or, in plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken a lot of interesting projects in my time, and while most have been both enriching and satisfying, there's one that I frankly wish that I could forget. And that's not down to the subject matter nor the people that I dealt with, as I cannot speak too highly of either, but rather a very particular encounter with a very particular woman while researching the kinship networks, ritual traditions, and sociocultural resilience of the Melungeon Appalachians. To cut a very, very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remains hotly debated, with theories ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi Native Americans. Genetic studies, such as those from the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws had been established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances are known to vary widely. Over time, many Melungeons have assimilated into broader populations, but these days, it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges what has traditionally been rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeons seemed like an incredible opportunity, and in anthropology it's rare to get one like that doesn't come with a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. And I was overjoyed to receive the news my proposal had been accepted. But if I'd have known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell that I'd ever have honored it. And this is why. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over the gravel as I wondered if the old girl was finally going to give up before I made it to my destination. The latest thread that I'd pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge, a place that, depending on which one you studied, wasn't even on the map. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that ostensibly deviated from normative physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured that there was no harm in chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside, smoke curled from chimneys, while a few folks lingered on porches watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe the air that smelled of damp earth and pine oil. A man in overalls nodded me from across the street, and I quietly nodded back, then headed inside the store. The store clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me up with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist, tracking Melungeon bloodlines, and he frowned, giving me another look of mistrust, and then pointed me toward a direct path leading up the ridge. "Folks up there don't take to outsiders," he said, and then told me, "Better mind yourself." I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, and then started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed up steep and cut through thick woods as my boots crunched on leaves and twigs, and it was tough going. But after maybe a mile or so, I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, and her eyes were dark and steady as I introduced myself, and I said that I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. "Mama's inside," she told me. "She the one you want to talk to." I stepped up onto the porch, and the door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall with weathered skin and white hair, who looked as if though they might be brothers. They didn't invite me in, and they didn't ask me what I wanted either. They just stared until I took the initiative and explained why I was there. I kept it simple, and then the slightly shorter man who had a scar across his cheek told me, "Mom was 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out." The other one nodded, and then they stepped out of the doorway and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke, with a dim living room lit by a single electric lamp. In the corner, lying in a single bed, was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say that she was skeletal, I mean that in the very sense of the word. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood, and while her eyes were sunk so far deep in their sockets that it made her look nothing short of ghostly. Her hair hung in these thin white strands, and her hands rested like claws by her sides, and her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly folks before, but she was something else. And as I sat down on a stool one of her sons dragged over for me, she exhibited no reaction to me whatsoever. Not a look, not a word, nothing. I started easy by asking her name. When she didn't respond, one of her sons whispered, "Oneida," from behind me. I then asked where her people came from, and she offered no answer, and her gaze remained locked on the near distance, unblinking. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood, but still got nothing, and her sons hovered nearby, their arms crossed as they watched. "She's weak," one of them eventually said. "Don't push her now." I told them that I understood, but my curiosity burned in my chest, and a 112-year-old who looked like she'd been starving for decades, I had to know more. I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft as I asked her, "Ma'am, how long have you lived for? And how have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word, and after her eyes widened and her lips parted, she turned to me with a look of fear on her face. And then, in a faint, raspy voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "It eats the years." And the strain of forcing out the words looked like it was killing her, and when she was done, her eyes rolled back and her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over, one yelling for me to get out while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering as the door slammed behind me. And then as I walked back down to the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed around my skull. What in the world did she mean by, "It eats the years"? I wanted to go back. I wanted that more than anything to just demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone, her bowl abandoned as I started down the path with the son's cry of "Don't come back" still ringing in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter and heavier, and as I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror much more frequently than usual. That night, I sat in my apartment replaying the day's events over and over in my head. Oneida's face wouldn't leave me, and neither would her words. and I tried to sleep, but the whole encounter just kept replaying in my mind. Then when I finally did get some sleep, I had the most vivid nightmare where it was me who was lying in that bed, more than a century old, crunching the words, "It eats the years," in the face of some terrified young researcher. And the next morning I called a research fellow that I happened to be friends with, a folklorist who'd written whole studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Oneida and what she'd said to me. And he went quiet for a few seconds, then after audibly clearing his throat said that he'd heard a lot of rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them because they never came with many details, just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He told me such a find might end up being a great source of pride for me and that he was excited to read my paper when it was finished. I thanked him, but after I hung up, I found myself even more unsettled than before. As the days went by, I found it impossible to think of anything else. Maybe it was the way my friend had hyped me up, but I simply had to know more. And so about a week later, I drove back to that village, parked my car, and then walked down that path again. But when I arrived at the village and walked up the ridgeline to where Oneida's home had been, no one was on the porches and the houses seemed empty. I reached Oneida's family home and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. However, upon finding that door was unlocked, my curiosity got the better of me and I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Oneida. I checked the other rooms. Nothing. No furniture or signs of life. I walked back outside and called out, but I got nothing but silence. And it was like everyone vanished. And weeks went by. I found myself avoiding my research, but the question still gnawed at me. What had Oneida meant by "it eats the years"? It obviously couldn't be literal, right? It had to be a metaphor, but for what? And why did it look like it scared her so badly? I began digging into my books, cross-referencing Melungeon folklore with anything I could find on Hollow Ridge, but I had no luck. I then engaged with the university's archival resources, including those in the North Carolina collection at Wilson's Special Collections Library, and it was there that I had a small but very significant breakthrough. One night, while elbow-deep in online research, I found an old journal scan dated from the 1700s that detailed a fur trapper's account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge to a T, and while he didn't provide much detail beyond the description, he stated very clearly that the place's unnatural temperament meant that he'd avoid a return visit no matter the cost. If you'd assumed my encounter with Oneida and her 2 sons failed to make it into my research paper, you'd be correct. I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what I'd seen and heard, but with nothing to reference outside of my own personal experience, doing so would have been fruitless at best and detrimental at worst. So instead of falling down a rabbit hole of a rather spurious nature, I decided that the best course of action was to simply try and forget about it. But I can't forget, and no matter how hard I try and rationalize what Oneida said to me, there's still something deeply unsettling about the way she acted while saying it. I wouldn't say that I've spent a lot of time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as other researchers, but I feel capable of distinguishing the confusion and fright of slowly losing one's mind from the very tangible terror associated with things people believe are real. But on that day, and in Oneida's eyes, I saw real emotion and real fear, and I'm in no hurry whatsoever to encounter it again in the near or distant future. Among the shadowy hollers of 19th century rural Tennessee, a series of terrifying occurrences would come to etch themselves into American folklore as some of the most sinister ever recorded. It was a force of malevolence so palpable, so relentless, that it claimed a life, drove a family to the brink of madness, and left a legacy of fear that lingers in the air of Robertson County to this day. But the force in question was no mere ghost story whispered around campfires. She was a woman who actually existed, and over time her deeds and devilry would earn her the nickname, the Bell Witch. This is not a tale of vague apparitions or spurious sightings. This is the true account of a presence so vile it defied explanation, and a nightmare that clawed its way into reality and refused to let go. The Bell family, consisting of John Sr., his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, had settled into their sprawling farmstead in 1804, and have since carved out a life of relative comfort amid the untamed beauty of the Tennessee frontier. For more than a decade, their days were marked by the rhythm of toil and harvest, the creak of wagon wheels, and the laughter of their many children. But in the summer of 1817, everything changed. It began with a knock on the cabin walls, sharp and insistent, like knuckles rapping on the other side of the grave. The family dismissed it, claiming the sound was the result of wind on a loose branch or perhaps a restless animal. But then came the scratches, clawing at the windows as if something begged to be allowed inside. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until the Bells could no longer deny them. John Bell Sr., a hardy, no-nonsense farmer with a dour demeanor, was the first to glimpse their vile visitor in the flesh. While walking through his cornfield one sweltering afternoon, he suddenly froze as a grotesque creature seemingly materialized before his eyes. He saw a dog-like beast with the head of a rabbit, its eyes glinting with a fiendish and unnatural hunger. In an instant, he shouldered and fired his musket, but as the shot echoed across the field, the canine creature vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of sulfur and a creeping dread in its wake. That night, the knocking returned, fiercer and angrier than before, as if the beast had followed John Sr. home. The children began to see things too. Betsy, John's youngest daughter, wept as she described a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. While Drury, one of his sons, swore a bird of monstrous size had flown down and perched itself atop the family barn, before staring at him with eyes that burned like fire and brimstone. And over time, the disturbances escalated with a ferocity that turned the Bell's family cabin into a crucible of terror. Furniture shook violently, while bed covers were ripped from sleeping bodies by invisible hands. Chains rattled across the floorboards, dragged by no discernible force, and the sightings of strange animals continued unabated. Then came the voices. They were mere whispers at first, hissing through the walls, followed by a raspy, guttural tone that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest circles of hell. "I am Kate," they declared. Suddenly, things started to make sense to old John Bell. Kate Batts had been the name of a deceased local woman rumored to have once cursed him over a land dispute. Yet whether it truly was her spirit or something far older masquerading in her name, no one could say. However, what was clear was that the spirit spoke with clarity that chilled the Bell family's blood, mocking them, revealing their deepest secrets, and taunting them with hints of horror yet to come. Little Betsy Bell, who was just 12 years old at the time, became Kate's favored target, as the witch poured her wrath upon her with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Invisible fists pummeled her fragile frame, leaving bruises and welts that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. Her hair was yanked into knots so tight that it drew blood, with her screams swallowed by the night as the witch's ethereal voice cackled in delight. "You'll never know peace," it snarled, pinning her to the bed with a weight no human could lift. The family watched, helpless, as Betsy's bright spirit withered under the relentless assault. Her eyes grew hollow, and her voice was reduced to a mere whimper as the witch continued to deny her any rest. Neighbors flocked to the farm, drawn by tales of the disturbances, only to flee in terror as the witch turned its malice on them. It twisted up their insides, causing unimaginable pain, while hurling objects and shrieking curses that echoed through the trees. The witch might have targeted his children for particularly cruel torment, but it was the family's patriarch, John Sr., who bore the brunt of the witch's ultimate vendetta. She vowed to destroy him, and she pursued her goal with a sadistic and satanic zeal. His health unraveled as the haunting intensified. His tongue was swelled inexplicably, choking off his words. His face twitched with spasms that contorted into a mask of agony, while his limbs seized as if controlled by some cruel and malevolent mistress. The witch taunted him endlessly, her voice a venomous hiss in his ears. "I'll take your life, John Bell, and I'll dance on your grave." Eventually, on December 20th of 1820, after 3 years of relentless torment, John Sr.'s body finally failed him. He was found lifeless in his bed, having passed in his sleep with a vial of strange, foul-smelling liquid beside him. The family later confirmed it was poison, supposedly fed to him by the witch. The state of Tennessee recorded John's death as the only one officially attributed to a supernatural entity, a grim testament to the power of old Kate bats, as well as the entity with which she'd compacted. Even Andrew Jackson, the fearless general and future president, proved unable to withstand the Bell Witch's fury. In 1819, he and his men camped on the Bell family's farm, eager to confront whatever entity inhabited the place. But as the wagon approached, its wheels locked inexplicably and the air filled with a deafening, hair-raising shriek. "I'd rather face the British Army than spend another night here," Jackson reportedly declared, fleeing before dawn with his troops in tow. If a man of his conviction was left quaking before the witch, what hope did a family of simple farmers have against it? The witch's reign of terror didn't end with John's death. It lingered, tormenting Betsy and the surviving Bells until 1821, when it abruptly announced its departure, but not without promising to return after 7 years. And true to its word, it reappears in 1828, shaking beds and whispering threats to Lucy and the remaining children before vanishing again. It vowed another return in 1935, 107 years later, and although no widespread haunting materialized, locals in Adams insist the entity never truly left. Strange lights flicker in the woods, disembodied screams pierce the silence of the night, and the Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow near the original farm, still undulates with an energy that drives visitors to the brink of sanity. Upon visiting the Bell Witch Cave, foolhardy visitors are greeted by what amounts to a gaping maw, its jagged walls glistening with slime and damp, while the air remains thick with a cloying and deeply unsettling stench. Those who brave its depths report footsteps echoing where no one walks, growls rumbling from the shadows, and a suffocating sense of being watched. In 1986, 2 reporters from the Tennessean planned to spend a night inside, armed with skepticism and flashlights. Yet staff writer David Gerard and staff photographer Bill Wilson lasted mere hours before bolting, driven out by guttural noises that swelled into a roar, a sound no cave should make. It was a short, powerful burst of sound that reverberated from the back of the cave and hit us like a slap, Gerard later wrote. It was not a metallic screech or the howl of wind. It was a vocal, loud, high-pitched scream, and we looked at each other, got through that gate, and quickly left the cave behind us. Of course, logically speaking, we frightened ourselves with our imaginations, Gerard continued. Or someone very much alive and human frightened us for fun and profit. Those are the reasonable explanations. But on the night in question, with my scalp tingling and my hair rising, our fear seemed reasonable, common sense. Gerard and Wilson seemed convinced that what they'd encountered was real, but was it actually the Bell Witch? And if so, what exactly is she? And many theories abound. Some call it Kate Bat's vengeful spirit, others a poltergeist fueled by Betsy Bell's adolescent turmoil. Yet some believe a demon masquerading as some kind of spirit is to blame. Science offers tepid explanations. Heavy metal poisoning might well account for John's symptoms, while mass hysteria seems to amplify and explain the rest. Yet such scientific theories fall flat against the hundreds of witnesses, from neighbors to clergy to President Jackson himself, who saw, heard, and felt the Bell Witch's wrathful presence. And surely no such hoax could sustain such terror for decades, nor would one be capable of leaving such a lasting scar on such a close-knit community. Today, the Bell family farm is long gone, but the Witch's Cave remains a pilgrimage site for thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators alike. Every creak of the trees, every unexplained shadow carries the echo of old Kate Bat's mysterious malice. Locals speak of her in hushed tones, wary of invoking her name lest she turn her gaze their way. A few years back, when I still lived with my parents, I used to stay in the room right next to my younger sisters. Sometimes while I was asleep, I would be awoken by the sound of someone coming into my room. When I would open my eyes, I would see my 4-year-old sister just staring at me in silence. After realizing it's only her, I would calm myself down and lead her back to her bed. I wasn't the only family member this happened to, and in the morning my sister would never remember it happened. Most of the time we would find her by the stairs on our way to the bathroom. My parents worried about her falling down, so they put a child gate in front of the stairs. On one occasion I remember seeing her standing in front of the gate, and as I approached her, she slowly pointed down the stairs. Being slightly creeped out, I just gently led her back to her room. It wasn't until summer came and I would stay up later that I would sometimes hear her talking to herself in the early hours of the morning. I used to think it was a little funny, but on a few occasions it really sounded like a lower voice would respond. I was too much of a chicken to ever check, so I would just decide it was time for bed and try not to think about it. Luckily, by the time she turned 5, it seemed like she finally grew out of it, since we never found her walking around the house again. I still wonder why it always seemed like she was trying to get one of us to lead her downstairs. Eva always lied. It was obvious from the very beginning that she was a compulsive liar. She would spin some off-kilter stories when she had the chance to. It wasn't out of any malicious intent, but rather, she simply couldn't resist telling a lie. Her lies were surreal and often just too ridiculous for others to take seriously. It didn't help that she was very young, at an age where we dismiss claims as being products of imagination, only 4 years old. Because of these factors, we didn't believe a word that she said to anyone. We didn't believe her when she said that her baby sister turned into a cat at night and purred at her. We didn't believe her when she said that the science teacher was secretly an alien robot. And when she said that her best friend wanted her to come play with her underneath her bed, we once again brushed it off. We really should have taken it seriously. But by the time that we found her bed empty that one morning, it was already too late. I moved into an old farmhouse in October 2015. It had been kept current until 1989, right down to the burgundy green hearts and apple borders in the middle of the walls. The house sits on a couple of acres. The closest neighbor is a walk away. Great trees, great bushes, love it. But lately, I've noticed weird things, like how none of the closets have doors, or how I wake suddenly just as I'm starting to drift off to sleep. How tired I am even though I'm in bed by 9 p.m. and can barely get out of bed at 7 a.m. The other really strange thing I've noticed is both my cats have disappeared, and none of the coyotes I hear at night come near the house, even though I've left the garbage bag outside accidentally. But the biggest thing I've noticed lately is how the hatch to my attic seems to always be open, though it used to be nailed shut.
My son went missing 2 weeks ago. Like a good parent, I filed a police complaint. I participated in the search efforts, and I was heartbroken when they could not find any trace of him. I gave up. I asked the cops to give up too. It was hopeless, I said. They did not give up. 1 week ago, 2 of the officers turned up at my door, triumphant smiles on their faces, and standing in front of them was my son. They said they found him wandering in the woods beyond the edge of town. He looked much worse for wear, but otherwise unscathed. They left him with me and went back to the station. He is not my son. He looked like my son, spoke like my son, and even behaved like my son. He settled in with me, but please believe me, he is not my son. Every night since that day, I've woken up in the middle of the night in cold sweat. I always see him in the doorway of my room, his body silhouetted by the night light behind him. He always leaves as soon as I wake up. Please, you have to trust me. Whatever he is not my son. Why do I seem so sure? Because I killed my son 2 weeks ago and buried him in the forest.
It was the summer between my 7th and 8th grades at a private Catholic middle school. I was a weird kid, and I went to the school in the 6th grade so I could be with my best friend growing up who had gone there for years. I'll call her Janie. Unfortunately, she was a year ahead of me and I didn't have a lot of friends in my own grade. I would just hang out with her and her friends after school. There was a teacher who started in my 7th grade year, a friend of the literary teacher who worked there. She was eccentric and fun among a group of otherwise standard Catholic school teachers, so when we all heard her friend was coming to teach, we were all excited to have a new teacher we all didn't hate. I'll call him Mr. Trenchman. He was a chubby guy, maybe in his late 30s. He always had his shirt untucked and his hair disheveled and a good amount of stubble on his face. He had really youthful brown eyes that made his students feel like he was one of them, and a dry sense of humor that most people ate up after being subjected to the point-blank lessons and lectures from every other teacher in every other class. I didn't have one class with him, but Janie did. She loved being his student, so trusting her, I thought he seemed like a pretty cool dude too. In the summer, Janie told me she was going to help out at the summer camp that he ran. The bus would pick her and the other students up every morning from her school and drop them back off in the evening. She was going for free since she had graduated and was technically a high school student. She and her friends were going to be volunteering as the camp counselors. I was upset. All of the friends I had would be going to his camp every day, and since I wasn't in high school and couldn't be a counselor, I wouldn't be able to afford to go. Mr. Trenchman took pity on me and told Janie to bring me along for free for the day. It was a good time. He'd been running the camp for years, and though everyone knew everyone, they were very inviting and friendly. I got to hang out with my friends all day, helping Mr. Trenchman and all of the older counselors keep the younger kids under control. Mr. Trenchman made me a deal. I could come every day and just pay about 20% of the price of the camp to cover the food and supplies I'd use. The rest of the 80% would be covered by me helping out. I think he knew I was a little lost, a year behind my friends, but too old to really enjoy the camp from a kid's perspective. So I took the deal and worked at the camp. It was a great summer. I got close with everyone there like a family. They'd all known Mr. Trenchman for years. He was a little different than he'd been in school. He was like a grumpy old dad, but he clearly loved his family. The summer ended and classes were about to start up when I'd heard that he would not be returning. He'd been emailing students, young female students, asking them to meet him at the school, help him set up his classroom, then maybe go out afterward, maybe go back to his place. I'm not sure of the extent of these emails. I never really wanted to know. One of these correspondences had been with Janie. I almost felt betrayed. We told each other everything, and I found out from my mom that she was one of the girls who came forward. I'm not sure what exactly happened next, except I remember my friend telling me that he told his best friend, the other teacher, that he was sick and he needed help or he couldn't stop, something along those lines. All gossip aside, he did end up in the hospital. We're not going to meet again because he died 2 days later. It was the strangest thing. The creepiest thing about this whole story happened about a month later. I was over at Janie's house, sitting in her room, and she went to the bathroom. She took a while, and I didn't have a cell phone or anything else to occupy me, so I grabbed her notebook. We both like to write a lot. We'd write stories and trade them and give feedback, so I didn't feel like I was really intruding. She'd written pages, probably about 20 to 25 pages, of a story about her and Mr. Trenchman. First they flirted, then they would be sitting too close, and she noticed the look in his eyes. Then he couldn't help himself, and he pulled her onto his lap, and they had sex. She wrote stories about her and Mr. Trenchman having sex. I didn't read much before I put the notebook down right where I found it. I never mentioned it to her. I never wanted to ask. I never wanted to know. Did something happen before she said something? Was there a possibility she had some part in it herself? Mr. Trenchman had died 2 days after his hospitalization, like I said. The cause of death, suicide. Now he may have been a tormented man, but sometimes I'm thankful that it ended this way. So when I was in my first year in high school, I had a teacher whose name was Dr. Johansson. He used to teach my class civics. He was a special fellow, not like other teachers. In the school I attended, teachers were often not close to students in a social way. They were simply there to teach, and that only. Dr. Johansson liked to keep contact with his students, so he decided it would be a lot easier to do so if he had a Facebook account. He started adding people on Facebook from our school, and eventually started talking to them. He often posted weird stuff on his wall, and commented weird things. For example, one time he posted the song Straight Outta Compton by NWA and wrote, "All they say is the N-word, 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 N-word. I don't get it." Of course, some students commented and asked him why he had used the N-word so freely. He removed the post and apologized, blamed it on being drunk. And this was nothing. He started talking to students, mostly boys, and he managed to find some students' numbers and started sending them texts randomly. He would send stuff like, "Do you need help with homework? You could come over to my place and I could help you out over a glass of wine." And this he would say to teens that were younger than 18 years old, so according to the law, they are not even allowed to drink. And he pretty much offered alcohol to minors. Remember, he's a civics teacher. He should know this stuff by heart. It's also morals, for God's sakes. Anyway, he never sent me a text, but he sent some weird texts to my friends. Later on, he decided to talk to me. This was a couple of weeks after he had started contacting students like this. He would speak to me on Facebook chat. He would ask me things like, "How do you get girls? Do you have a big dick? Do you often get to sleep with girls after your shows?" He because I'm an artist, and I found these messages highly disturbing. They became worse, like, "You must be such a stallion in bed. You were probably really good, and enter the rabbit hole with me. Come on, I'll take care of you." I had no clue what the fuck that meant. And that wasn't even everything. After a while, things started to get out of control. He started asking me to go out with him to the clubs, and I wasn't even of age at the time, and he said he could get me into the clubs with no ID and all would be well. Of course, I said no. He then apparently got pissed at me and decided not to speak to me much after that, since I had turned him down a few times. He started talking to one of my nearest friends instead. It ended up with Dr. Johansson sending my friend a picture of his ass with the caption, "Please, take me from behind and take me hard." Mind you, my friend was 17 at the time, whilst Dr. Johnson was around his mid-30s. This was taken to court and Dr. Johansson got his little sentence. He was to do community service for a little while, and then he was to pay my friend a fine. That was it. Dr. Johansson still works at a school today and is totally accepted. I find that very wrong, people. Very wrong. A man like that should not be able to get into that line of work again. Things could have gotten much, much worse. I was in primary school, so about 10 years ago. This woman explains that our teacher is ill and she is covering. No big deal, it happens sometimes, and we crack on with our work. For the next few hours, she gets stranger and stranger. It starts off with her talking about God and how he can see us and is with us, and he talks to her. Then she starts walking around gently squeezing our necks occasionally with both of her hands. Some of us said we needed the loo and went to tell the headmaster instead. He appeared a few minutes later, and after trying to get her out of the classroom, ends up having to physically wrestle her out. We were left alone for 3 hours, and no one even moved. Later I was told by my mom that the teacher had a nervous breakdown, and she was to never work in that school again. I was about maybe 5 years old when my parents decided to follow the typical Chinese stereotype of pushing me to play an instrument. Not just any instrument though, it had to be piano or violin. I decided on violin mainly because every other girl in my family already had piano lessons, so I wanted to be a bit different. Since my parents didn't have a great grasp on English, they wanted Chinese-speaking instructors, which made for quite a few impractical situations given how rare they were. My first violin teacher did not perform house visits, so we had to take the train about 40 minutes to see him every week. He was also pretty harsh and had little patience for a scree-scrawling 5-year-old violinist, so my parents and I decided to try and find a new instructor. Enter Mr. Chan, a violinist who I would estimate to be in about his mid-30s. His price was cheap, and he had also made house visits, which we were pretty happy about. Mr. Chan was a soft-spoken man, and as a kid I thought he was the nicest person in the world. Whenever he came by, he would always give me a piece of candy and hug me when the lesson was over. There would be a few things that he did that made me feel pretty uncomfortable though. He often looked at me with these smoldering eyes. As a kid, I thought that maybe those were just what he looked like, but at times it creeped me out because it felt like he was staring into my soul. Also, when instructing me, instead of telling me something like, "Now put your finger on the E string," he would just tenderly move it for me. If there was any opportunity for him to touch me, he would always do it, moving my fingers, adjusting my arms and head for posture. All of these things I brushed off mainly because I was a kid who didn't know any better. After all, he was a great violin teacher and I legitimately learned a lot from him. One day, Mr. Chan stopped coming to lessons and we had to get a new teacher. I cried and threw a huge tantrum because I thought he was the nicest guy ever and I missed the candies, but they refused to explain why he left. Years later when I was 12, my family decided to break the news to me about what had happened. Apparently, Mr. Chan got arrested for molesting one of his violin students, another girl who was about my age. I wonder if he charmed her in the same way. One of the creepiest events in my own experience that I can recall happened when I was about 9 years old, late 1978 to early 1979 if I am not mistaken, which would have put me in the 4th grade at the time. Just a bit of background information on my school here. It was a newer school for my district at the time, and I guess as an experiment in innovative architecture, the school had no square angles in the walls at all. Rather, for simplicity's sake, imagine a U shape where the opening of the U faces onto the parking lot, but where there were hexagons attached to the outer edge of the U. Each of those hexagons was called a pod, and each pod was divided into 6 classrooms and one central area for that pod, from which a person could see into any of the 6 classrooms at one time. The playground was the entire area outside the U-shaped collection of pods, first being blacktop and then, further out, grassy field. Critically, this meant that if you were very close to the pods, it was possible for someone else, also close to the pods, to be within 20 feet of you and still be hidden around the bend of the wall. So on this day in 1978 or 1979, my school had open house or parent-teacher conferences. This is when parents were welcome to come to the school and talk with one another, especially with their children's teachers, and to see how their child or children were performing in the school. My mom never missed one of these, and this day was no exception. We went to the school and saw all the teachers and kids and parents gathered in the cafeteria. After whatever general address the principal had to make, everyone went their separate ways to meet one-on-one. My mom had teachers to meet for 2 children, for me and my older brother, who was 1 year ahead of me. When we met my teacher, Mrs. Holbrook, my mom brought me and my brother into the classroom. She apparently had good things to say about me, and we were done quickly. But when we met my older brother's teacher, Mr. Covey, for some reason my mom told me to go out on the playground and play. My brother remained in the classroom with my mom and his teacher. It was still light outside, so all seemed okay. However, by this time an hour or more had probably passed since the principal's speech ended. Any parents who attended for that only, or who only wanted to meet a single teacher briefly, had done so by now and left. The playground area was devoid of people. Naive little boy that I was, I just walked around the pods like I was in my own house, and I stayed close to the outer wall of the pods for no real reason. All of a sudden, without hearing or seeing anything to prepare me for what was about to happen, I was pinched across the back of the neck very hard. The hand that held me seemed too strong for me to break away, and I didn't even have time to try before a voice whispered in my ear to stay still and not turn around. I nodded as best as I could. Then the voice told me to walk, and it led me around the pod to within sight of the parking lot where a few cars remained. The voice asked me if I saw the green car, the station wagon with wooden paneling on it. I did and indicated so. The voice told me, "Walk to that car, get inside and wait there. Do not turn around. I will be right behind you, and if you turn around, I will know you did. Do you understand me?" All the while the owner of the hand and of the harsh whispers squeezed my neck harder at intervals to add emphasis to certain points. The person then sent me walking to that car. I think I know how the condemned, dead man walking must feel. I was a naive boy, but not so naive as to believe getting in that car was a good idea. On the other hand, I felt sure that turning around was death if the owner of that voice was still really there. I had gotten halfway to the car when I wound up freezing, unsure what to do. I just stood there crying, which was already an improvement over the extraordinary fear that preceded it. I don't know if I stood there seconds or minutes, but eventually I turned around. Nobody was there. I figured they were back around the pod, peeking, waiting, but my mom was that direction also, so I swung way out into the playground area and walked carefully back around. Somewhere near where I was originally pinched were 2 boys a year ahead of me, my older brother's age, playing marbles, Roger and another boy whose name I never knew. I avoided them, feeling sure they, Roger particularly, were probably the ones who had pinched me, but I am sure at some point they noticed me passing them at a distance. They did not react at all. In fact, my brother talked about Roger much later by chance in terms that caused me to believe he was a nice guy. Probably as importantly, later reflection led me to consider the whispered voice and the powerful hand to most likely have belonged to an adult male, not to a fellow child. But why did that fool want me in Mr. Covey's car? Mr. Covey was in a conference with my mom, so it was not his doing. My only other guess was my third-grade teacher, Dr. Schofield, who had once grabbed me violently when I got up from my chair in class without permission while he was in a bad mood. That dude was eventually arrested in 1980 on suspicion of having molested 4 boys earlier the same year, a year after my traumatic experience on the playground. I'll never know for sure, but I will always wonder who it was. All throughout high school, there was a teacher who I had referred to as Creepy Creep. He deserved this name, and throughout the story, I hope you can understand why. It all started in my freshman year. This teacher was an inclusion teacher, meaning he was in charge of taking care of the special needs kids that were allowed to be in the same classes as everyone else. Creepy Creep always seemed alone, and I always felt bad for him, so one day I complimented him on his haircut. I always regretted doing this because, ever since, he was always in the same place as me. Later in my freshman year, I had broken my toe at a haunted house. After I came to the school for the first time after I broke it, he stopped me in the hallway to tell me I should avoid haunted houses. I just laughed it off, but later it hit me that it was really odd that he knew how I broke my toe because I hadn't actually told anyone at school. The next school year, he would always sit with me at my lunch table until my friends showed up. That same year, he was running up the stairs and accidentally tripped, which I just happened to see. He seemed fine until he noticed I was one of the students who saw. He started crying, and later that day, he sat with me at lunch apologizing that he never wanted to embarrass himself in front of me like that. My junior year, he gave me this huge hug on the first day, telling me how much he missed me over the summer. This year, he would always sit with me at lunch even after my friends would show up. He said my friends weren't true friends if they had had problems with us sitting together. One day at lunch, I was talking about how I was leaving early for a dentist appointment. He asked what time I was leaving, and I said right after lunch. Then a few minutes later, he left, which I was honestly so grateful for. Once I got to my car to leave, it wouldn't start. Creepy Creep just happened to be out there, though, and offered to give me a ride home. I told him it was fine because my stepdad was on his way to get me, and anyways had to get back to school. Creepy Creep told me it wouldn't take any time for him to take me home since my house was just down the road. That's when I got really freaked out, because he knew where I lived. Luckily, my stepdad showed up just in time. Creepy Creep actually introduced himself to my stepdad, saying it was nice to finally meet the man who raised such a beautiful girl. My senior year, I ended up going to a different school, and I got a new job as a delivery driver. About a week into the job, there was a special note on the bottom of the delivery saying, "Bring the back door, and you can just walk in," which wasn't too odd to me because sometimes that's a common note on delivery for elderly people who can't make it to the door. So I made it to the delivery and went inside, but it was no other than Creepy Creep. When I walked in, he went in for a kiss, telling me how much he missed me. I was so terrified because not only was this Mr. Creepy stalking teacher, but he also just kissed me. He told me how upset he was to not hear from me on our 2-year anniversary, but he said he understood because it's hard to keep in touch after being at different schools. He asked me to quit my job and just stay with him for the rest of the day so we could celebrate our anniversary the proper way. Luckily, my boss called yelling at me for taking so long on my delivery, so I told Creepy Creep that I had to go quit my job in person so I wouldn't get in trouble for keeping the money from his delivery. Then I would come right back. He was so happy and said he was so excited to see me putting more effort into our relationship. So I quit my job, then went straight home and told my parents everything. I never heard from Creepy Creep ever again. I was in 5th grade. My teacher was a very sweet lady, the kind who would call you baby and sugar and all that. She was very laid back and patient. Then she got ill, flu symptoms. She took a couple of weeks off and some days, but had to come back because she couldn't continuously keep taking off, and she looked worse than what she did when she initially took sick leave. She was very feverish and flu-like, but she was very agitated. She couldn't hold still, had a bad temper, her mouth kind of slacked on the left side, like she had a stroke or something. She was snappy and talking to herself, saying things like, "I should probably go to the doctor," and stuff, and biting her nails. She had bitten them so much that they bled. Then things got nasty. One kid, who was slightly special, couldn't understand a worksheet, and she completely lost it. She was throwing stuff and calling him awful names. When I tried to intervene, she came at me and tried to bite me, like she was foaming at the mouth and trying to attack me. By the time people finally found out what was going down, she was on the floor having a grand mal seizure, foaming, her eyes rolling in the back of her head. Sometime later, I found out that she had died shortly thereafter. Trying to find out what happened, police went to her house where they found her dead dog and a dead raccoon somewhere in the house. All 3 tested positive for the rabies virus. I still have nightmares about her, and I always keep my animals up to date on their vaccinations. This happened when I was in 9th grade. I had matured early, so I received a lot of gross comments in 7th through 9th grade. This made me lose confidence in myself, so instead of being very sociable and outgoing like I used to be, I was shy and awkward. I had 0 friends, literally 0, so teachers often came up to me and asked me if I was lonely and just showed interest in me because I seemed depressed or whatever. My English teacher's name was Mr. Z. He had the creepiest blue eyes, and his smile was even creepier. On the first day of school, he asked us all about ourselves, what our favorite subject was, and our names, but he always called on me even though I never raised my hand. When he asked me, I would speak quietly because everyone stared at me, and it made him laugh. He used to call me Goodheart. Towards the middle of the year, I noticed that he showed me a lot of favoritism. If he took away our privileges to go to the bathroom, he would say something like, "Take this to the office," and then whisper, "Go to the bathroom if you have to." When we received our progress reports, I would have A's on assignments I have never done. I never told anyone about that because English was a class I had to pass in order to graduate. As the school year went on, I started to realize that he never looked me in the eyes. He would stare at my chest, then my legs, at the floor, etc. And when he did look at me, he barely blinked, which made me look away instead. It was very awkward. When I first noticed him blatantly staring at my chest, I didn't think much of it at the time because I'm not very blessed in the chest, so guys usually looked at my butt instead. I just figured there was something on my shirt, the first few times. Towards the end of the year, he started asking me to come into his room during lunch so I could help him grade. When I came to his room, he'd have a movie on and we'd watch that for my lunch. He didn't have to teach a class after, so he let me skip my class afterwards. One thing I noticed right away was that there was sex scenes in every movie we watched. He asked me if I wanted to skip, and I'd shrug because I wanted to act mature. It started to happen every day. We'd watch a movie every day, which all had very awkward sex scenes. At the end of the school year, we watched our last movie, and this time the scene was very long and very detailed and very awkward. He put his hand on my leg gently and laughed. "It'll be over soon," he said. He kept his hand on my leg for the whole thing. Luckily, when the bell rang, I left. I didn't say bye, I just left. The reason why I wrote this is because I saw him at Petco, my job, a week ago. I didn't think he'd recognize me. I wear glasses now, dyed my hair blonde, and lost a little weight. I was helping one line of people which had about 5 people in it, and my coworker was working with a line that had 2. He stood on my line and waited for everyone to finish, even though the other line was empty. When I took his things, avoiding eye contact the whole time, he stared at me. I didn't look up because I didn't want to meet his gaze. Towards the end of the transaction, he started asking me about my life, did I like my job, how my family was doing, etc. I just gave him short, simple answers while he drilled a hole into my face with his eyes. After we were finished, he smiled and said, "I'll be back again. Good heart." After freshman year, he was no longer a teacher at my school. I never found out why. This happened with my music teacher when I was in the 5th grade. He was new, filling in for a few months for my normal music teacher who had just had surgery. He was a lot older, a very big fat guy who was always sweaty, and he had fidgety hands and shifty eyes. He was very creepy. In 5th grade, I was already developing and all that good stuff. I also admired my older sister and wanted to be just like her. She would wear these tiny mini skirts, and I was dying to get some. Well, my mom wasn't having any of that. She didn't even want her own grown daughter wearing them. She bought me these things called skirts. They were short skirts, but had shorts sewn into them on the inside, so if anyone ever looked up your skirt or anything, they wouldn't get a peep at the goods. So anyways, he shows up and he creeps me out right off the bat. He's nice enough, he just has this super creepy vibe. He's also really shifty and fidgety. He almost seems nervous to be around children, just really weird overall. Then the comments started. He would harass me about my skirts. He said they were too short. I told him that they had shorts made into them. He told me that he knew I was lying, and I'm pretty sure he basically admitted to me that he had looked up my skirt on numerous occasions. He also told me he could see right through me. This went on every day, creepy comments about my clothes and him staring holes in me. He would also single me out to answer weird questions or call me out on something. As far as I knew, he didn't treat any other students this way. I ended up telling my mom, who was a serious mama bear. She went to my principal, and they arranged a meeting between my principal and vice principal, the creepy teacher in question, and my mom and dad. My mom is very short and thin, but my dad is like 6'2" and 250 pounds of muscle. He is also very protective of me. So I'm not entirely sure what happened at that meeting, but I do know my dad never said a word to the man, just stared at him the whole time like, "I know you creeped my daughter, and I am not afraid to hurt you." My mom also went off on him. She really let him have it. He kept changing his story. I don't think he knew it was being recorded. They ended up playing the recording back and catching him in several lies. He was immediately terminated. I go to a medium-sized school, about 400 students per class. However, we only have about 100 students enrolled in AP Physics every year, so we only have one teacher for the subject. The longtime physics teacher retired, so the school board hired, we'll call him Mr. Sykes. Anyways, from the first day of school, everyone could tell he was, well, different. He would blow up over the smallest things, such as someone writing a formula wrong, just about absolutely go ballistic. The first week of school, he made over 5 students cry because of his outbursts. My chemistry teacher is the science department leader, so she was very disturbed by these actions. One day, she was going to talk to him about this and if he needs to make some changes or the students need remediation. He was not in his room, but she found a pillow and a sleeping bag and some of his clothes hanging in the teacher locker every room has. This seemed a little suspicious, but she didn't overthink it and forgot about it. Fast forward to December. My teacher's son was in the marching band for school and she had to pick him up around 11 p.m. due to a game very far away. She noticed his car was still there. This made her grow more suspicious, because really, what teacher would be there at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night? As the following week went on, Mr. Sykes' outbursts got worse and the students began to fear him more. The following Saturday, my teacher's kids were sick with a stomach bug, so she went to good old Walmart for some ginger ale, and on the way home, she decided to drive by the school to see if Mr. Sykes' car was still there. Sure enough, it was. The following week, the physics students were notified that Mr. Sykes would be leaving that week, and they could either drop the class without a penalty on their transcript or take it online. The first day of Christmas break, the janitor who was cleaning the school texted my teacher and said Mr. Sykes was standing in his empty classroom staring at the wall. She said that if he was still there when he left, to call the principals and possibly the police. He was there 5 hours later, staring at the wall. My principal and vice principal and the police had to end up coming and escorting him out. A week later, my teacher was checking the supplies in the room, making sure everything was okay for write-up. As she was going through his drawers, she found various items such as razors, rat poison, and acids. We still have no idea what he was planning on doing with them. I read a story about someone's creepy teacher and his lewd actions towards them. This reminded me of my teacher from 9th grade. Mr. Gorey was an English teacher at Davies Technical High School. He gave us tons of work to do to keep us occupied, mostly note copying. From about the first month into school, I knew something was off about him. He once referred to a scenario after reading out loud a story by Edgar Allan Poe, where he was a serial killer and he picked girls out of the class who had natural blonde highlights in their hair to demonstrate how a murderer chooses his victims. I was one of the few girls he chose, which I found odd because I had dark brown hair. I always got creepy feelings around him, and because of these feelings and a few other reasons, I transferred to my local high school halfway through the year. It turns out I made the right move. Last year, one of my friends came up to me and told me that Gorey was arrested for possession of child porn on his computer and having relations with a 16-year-old student. I'm happy I trusted my instincts and got out of there. I don't want to give away a lot about my identity, but I will say that this takes place in a small town in Ontario where I grew up during 7th grade. So me and everyone in my class would have been about 12. For the first part of 7th grade, we had a substitute teacher, Mr. I, who was only there until the actual teacher, Mr. C, came back from sick leave due to mental health issues we later found out. Mr. I was great, and he left after the winter break. That's when Mr. C showed up. He was kind of a creep from the start. He used to make a lot of little creepy remarks we would let slide, but eventually it escalated. One encounter I recall is that one day during recess, he tried to get me and a friend, Rachel, to say different words for penis and would ask us if we were comfortable with saying things like that, etc. Now, as young girls, we decided to tell our parents, and they were pissed, and called the school, which obviously did nothing about it because otherwise the rest of this wouldn't have taken place. Fast forward a couple of creepy months. Me and Rachel are in the gymnasium with the rest of our class, about 20 kids. We were doing the gymnastics portion of our gym program. We were halfway through the class, and Rachel gets up and goes to the part of the gym where we would leave our shoes. So I turn around to look for her after a bit, and to my surprise, she is standing there across the gym in shock, holding a video camera. Now at this point, no one else has really noticed, and I haven't put two and two together yet, but what happened next made me clue in pretty damn fast. Mr. C, who was at the time lounging around the gym not really doing anything, sees Rachel with this camera. I swear to God, his face went from not having a care in the world to utter horror in all of a second. He grabbed a soccer ball from a nearby rack and chucked it across the room at Rachel. In front of over fucking 20 12-year-old kids. It hit her dead in the side of the face. She dropped the camera, screamed, and ran out of the room and into the office. Me and anyone else in the class also ran out of the room in pursuit of her before Mr. C could do who the fuck knows what else. He grabbed his camera and ran out of the school. I never saw him again. Rachel, who happened to live on the same street as me, has friendly parents who talk to mine occasionally. We later learned that they pressed charges, and he was convicted of assault on a minor and also intent to harm minors or something along those lines. He had been taping our class since he had begun teaching us. He had dozens of tapes of our gym classes. He would position the cameras in different places to capture the most revealing angles for whatever it was we would be doing that day. Needless to say, we got a new teacher for the rest of the year, which was kind of awesome at least because she let us do whatever we wanted pretty much. In hindsight, everything about him seems so menacing now, from accidentally walking into our changing rooms to extensive health lessons about sex.